Greetings. Thanks for taking the time to listen in on our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. This workshop is about defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. Now, this is our schedule for the fall. It's every Tuesday, and today we'll be discussing the Pacific Part 1. And note, if you're interested in the more theoretical / conceptual ideas of this workshop, you can watch the ones from summer that go into detail about what these different concepts of cooperation and conflict are. All right, so let's go ahead and jump to our week 5, which is the Pacific Part 1. And here you see a picture of Google Earth, which has the Pacific front and center. This little chain of islands here is Hawaii, and you get a sense of the California coast on this side, and then a sense of the Japanese coast here. But just realize how massive the Pacific is, right? This is a huge body of water. It's the largest ocean in the world. And we're going to focus on it for this week and for next week as well. So our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is to define the Pacific region. Secondly is to describe an example of conflict in the region. And then thirdly is to describe an example of cooperation in the region. All right, let's go ahead and jump to a picture of this. This is a picture of the Pacific, or what they call the Pacific Rim. And the Pacific Rim is essentially all of the nations and the countries that border the Pacific Ocean. So here on the eastern front, you'll see the North American and the South American continents, right? With major cities like Vancouver, San Francisco, Los Angeles, countries like Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and then South American continent, so Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. If you go all the way over to the west side of the Pacific Ocean, you'll see here at the bottom left, the country of Australia, Papua New Guinea, Java, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia. And then once you start heading up north, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, China, Japan, North Korea, and South Korea. And then at this top part, we have the Bering Sea, and then obviously the Aleutian Islands of the United States, and the Kamchatka Peninsula, and the Sea of Irkutsk here in north in the Russian Federation. And then within the Pacific Ocean itself, we have the Hawaiian Islands, the Marshall Islands, and then a whole range of other island nations throughout the region. And then let's not forget our good friends in New Zealand, the Kiwis. So this is the Pacific Rim. This is again, massive part of the world, with the world's global superpower, the United States, and then an emerging superpower, Russia, and then a former superpower, Russia, and our friends in Europe, Africa, and West Asia are on the other side of the world. So this is just a huge geographic region, which has major implications in the past and in the present and on into the future. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of conflict in the Pacific. So I'd like to share here is the Pacific War from World War II. And we'll go ahead and open up this page on Wikipedia that describes in great detail what that war in the Pacific was, and what it meant for not just the nations of the United States and Japan, but also China and Australia. So let me go ahead and bring that window over here to our side. And we'll go ahead and play a few paragraphs of this just so you get a sense of the history of this region. Right click and read the section aloud. And let me see, let me change the voice here. I'm always changing it up so we have a little bit of a little bit here, a little bit there. So let's go ahead and play in this language. So there you get a sense of the depth of the war and of the conflict that occurred in the region. And I think this is important to highlight because it basically gives us a strong sense of how World War II, between the various great powers around the world, really brought the Pacific to the forefront as a theater of battle, and how it helped or it advanced naval warfare and air warfare for the entire world. And so I just like to highlight this because this is one of the clearest examples, and in many historians' view, the quintessential example of an ocean war, of an ocean conflict, right? Because of the amount of naval forces, air forces, even ground forces on the various islands throughout the Pacific Rim, and just the massive scope of the conflict. So that gives us a sense of it. There's also another Wikipedia page that gets into more detail about how this Pacific Ocean was a theater. One thing I'd like to do is point out this the structure of the U.S. military at the time. So we had the combined chiefs of staffs, and then we had the joint chiefs of staffs for both, in this case, the chief of naval operations and the Army chief of staff. And then within those, we had Chester Nimitz on the naval side, and then Douglas MacArthur on the Army side. And then you see the complexity here. So the Pacific Ocean areas and the Pacific Fleet, which included all these different elements: North Pacific, Central Pacific, South Pacific, and then with the Army, it was the Southwest Pacific area. So we had a very complex military structure with hundreds of thousands of troops throughout that region. And this webpage goes into really great detail about all of the different battles throughout that time, starting with obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and then concluding with the final battles of the Aleutian Islands and Komodorsky Islands in this case, that's a different region, but in 1945 here in the Pacific theater. And then these were obviously in the different part of the Pacific. So I encourage you to take a look at this, engage with it. This is an example of conflict, right, in this part of the world. Okay, next, let's go to an example of cooperation. So I'd like to pull up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we'll go ahead and jump to Wiki again, and we'll have this play to us. And I made sure that the audio was on this time. So if the audio wasn't on the first time, I apologize about that. There'll be some time there, but we'll go ahead and play this one for ourselves. And again, I'll change the voice here to kind of give us some variation on that. Okay, and we'll play a little bit faster. Okay, let's go.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, was a proposed trade agreement between Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and the United States, signed on the 4th of February 2016. After the newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump withdrew the U.S. signature from TPP in January 2017, the agreement could not be ratified as required and did not enter into force. The remaining countries negotiated a new trade agreement called Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which incorporates most of the provisions of the TPP, and which entered into force on the 30th of December 2018. The TPP began as an expansion of the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement, TPSEP, or P4, signed by Brunei, Chile, New Zealand and Singapore in 2005. Beginning in 2008, additional countries joined the discussion for a broader agreement: Australia, Canada, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, the United States, and Vietnam, bringing the negotiating countries to 12. In January 2017, the United States withdrew from the agreement. The other 11 TPP countries agreed in May 2017 to revive it, 8, and reached agreement in January 2018. In March 2018, the 11 countries signed the revised version of the agreement, called Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, 9, after ratification by 6 of them, Australia, Canada, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand and Singapore. The agreement came into force for those countries on the 30th of December 2018. The original TPP contained measures to lower both non-tariff and tariff barriers to trade, 10. And establish an investor-state dispute settlement ISDS mechanism. 11. 12. The U.S. International Trade Commission. 13. The Peterson Institute for International Economics. The World Bank and the Office of the Chief Economist at Global Affairs Canada found the final agreement would, if ratified, lead to net positive economic outcomes for all signatories, while an analysis using an alternative methodology by two Tufts University economists found the agreement would adversely affect the signatories. Note 1. Many observers have argued the trade deal would have served a geopolitical purpose, namely to reduce the signatories' dependence on Chinese trade and bring the signatories closer to the United States.
And so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, just to make it clear, was a proposed trade agreement between these various countries in the Pacific Rim. And it became a political issue during the 2016 presidential campaign. At that point, it was businessman Donald Trump and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton vying for that role. We obviously know that that Donald Trump won that election. And so this one of his first acts as president was to withdraw the United States from this process and to not join this Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and open up another page here that talks about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the summary of the U.S. objectives. This is from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is the official individual who works on behalf of the president to engage with countries around the world on developing and enforcing trade agreements. So I'm going to go ahead and play this part here because it gives you a sense of what the then Obama administration was looking to accomplish. So let's go ahead and have this played for us. And it sounds like we have a little delay, so I'll go ahead and read it. The Obama administration is pursuing the TPP, so obviously this is talking about the past, to unlock opportunities for American manufacturers, workers, service providers, farmers, and ranchers to support job creation and wage growth. We're working hard to ensure that TPP will be a comprehensive deal, provide new and meaningful market access for goods and services, strong and enforceable labor standards and environmental commitments, groundbreaking new rules designed to ensure fair competition between state-owned enterprises, called SOEs, and private companies, commitments that will improve the transparency and consistency of regulatory environment to make it easier for small and medium-sized businesses to operate across the region, a robust intellectual property, IP rights, framework to promote innovation while supporting access to innovative and generic medicines and an open internet, and obligations that will promote a thriving digital economy, including new rules to ensure the free flow of data. Now, this was negotiated obviously by President Obama and his U.S. trade representative, and a whole bunch of folks were on board with this. And this was a part of a broader effort by then President Obama, what he called the Asian pivot. Since World War II, the United States has always been focused on the Atlantic Ocean relationship with Europe and the at that time the Cold War with this Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. And then after that power balance changed in the late 80s and early 90s, the U.S. kind of emerged as the superpower through the 90s up until the 2000s and even to today. But at the same time, the United States has been very cognizant that their power is being challenged by another one, growing power, in this case, the country of China and the government of China, that President Obama saw the Pacific, given that it's on one side of the Pacific, we call our image as the United States, and on the other side of the Pacific, we have the country of China, that there needed to be something done that was non-military to build this and strengthen the relationships between the United States and that region. So President Obama's answer to the question of what does the United States do in the Pacific Rim or the Pacific Ocean to promote cooperation and at the same time act as a somewhat counter effect or to change the economic relationship between regions, well, then let's go for this trade agreement. But then that was not fulfilled by the incoming Trump administration. So what are some of the implications, right, of this cooperation, of this conflict and this cooperation? So I'm going to go ahead and open up this article titled Biden and Xi, so President Biden now, and then President Xi of China discuss need to avoid conflict amid global competition. So this article was published just about a week ago, and I'll go ahead and go into read mode, and let's see if this can be read to us. And it's for one reason or the other, it's not doing it. So let me go ahead and pause this for a second. I'm going to move this window up and we'll just close this whole window. Sometimes closing and opening the window will do the trick. So let's take a look, see if we open a new window, if that will help. Bring it over here. Appreciate your patience. All right, let's go ahead and see again. Give this a moment to load. And this is a picture of both President Biden and President Z on this. Let's go into read mode and see if it'll work now. It's not going. So I'll go ahead and read it. So President Joe Biden told Chinese leader Xi Jinping late Thursday that the United States wants to, quote, responsibly manage the competition, close quote, between the two countries in hopes of avoiding conflict. The two leaders held their second call since President Biden took office at the time when Washington and Beijing are increasingly at odds on issues ranging from cybersecurity to trade. And the White House stressed that the discussion was about high-level themes. A senior Biden administration official said the call lasted around 90 minutes and that the tone was candid and familiar. Both Biden and especially Xi referred to their past personal interactions, the official said. Quote, the two leaders had a broad strategic discussion in which they discussed areas where our interests converge and areas where interest values and perspectives diverge. They agreed to engage on both sets of issues openly and straightforwardly, the White House said in a readout of the call. The two leaders discussed the responsibility of both nations to ensure competition does not veer into conflict. And so this is a rather significant development because what had been happening since Biden has taken office is that there have been staff level conversations on a range of issues, and it just didn't seem to be moving the way that the president was expecting. And so at that point, what happens is, we got to have a leader to leader conversation. So if you think about what this is representing, right, it's in light of the fact that the U.S. is not in a trade agreement with other countries on the Pacific Rim, because after the United States withdrew back in 2017 from the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership, the country of China, the Chinese government began to reach out to those same countries and say, hey, how about we all enter some kind of economic relationships or strengthen our economic ties or bonds with each other. And so we start to see this narrative that happens, right? This notion that the conflict exists, and then we have cooperation, but then maybe if that cooperation fails, we'll start to see the beginnings of conflict again. And so I bring this to your attention because the Pacific is such a complex area, and there's just been some recent develops in the past couple of weeks that we'll talk about in our next workshop that demonstrate just how some of these decisions cascading over time might have long-term implications. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen in, and I look forward to seeing you at another workshop. So take care.